warm outside. Let's talk about some hunger options for the Mummy archetype in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I'm the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I'm a storyteller who gets a little too wrapped up in his work sometimes. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today I wanted to do a short video on the Mummy archetype that is found in Book of the Dead. Now Book of the Dead is one of the recent releases by Paizo for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and it has tons of content for both battling undead in Pathfinder 2e and playing undead in Pathfinder 2e as well. I know that the idea of playing undead PCs generated a lot of excitement in the Pathfinder community, and when Book of the Dead dropped, there was definitely a lot of interesting stuff to be found inside of this particular product. Now, today's video is going to be a very short video, and if I'm being honest, this is filler. Mostly because when I was planning out my video schedule, I forgot to account for conference season with my IRL job. Sorry about that, guys. But there is one thing that Paizo wrote about in Book of the Dead that has generated a lot of positive conversation online, but I've also noticed that it left a very obvious gap with Book of the Dead, and that is the concept of hunger. In short, hunger is a driving or motivating force for any undead creature. This is the vampiric hunger for blood, or the zombies' hunger for brains. All undead have something that innately drives them, often to very destructive ends. And I think that this concept of hunger was a very good storytelling point that Paizo included when they wrote Book of the Dead. I think it naturally leads to very good storytelling moments, but it also ended up causing a major storytelling gap in that a lot of people have noticed that the Mummy archetype, which is shared in Book of the Dead, does not have any listed hunger. So today, I'm going to offer some options that you can use for hunger for the Mummy archetype, talk a little bit about the possible storytelling implications of those given hungers, and take a look at some of the mechanical elements that could justify those choices if you wanted to go that direction. But before all of that, just remember that the spirits of the great beyond compel you to like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. And you can converse with eternal minds of incredible wisdom by joining my free Discord community, which is linked in the video description. My Patreon is down there as well. Let's get started. Now, really quick, I would like to say that at least some of my ideas in this video, I am drawing inspiration from some of the other RPGs that I've played. In particular, I'm going to be taking some inspiration today from the old White Wolf game, Mummy the Resurrection. So if you've played that game and some of the ideas that I am sharing sound similar to you, yes, I'm totally drawing some ideas from this product, and I think that this could be an interesting read if you are interested in playing a Mummy-style character. However, when it comes to Pathfinder 2e, the resources for playing mummies can be found in the Book of the Dead for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, the section on playing undead PCs in general starts on page 44 of that book, and the introduction to that section does have some important concepts that you'd want to read up on. We're not diving into all the mechanics in this video, but you definitely want to read the playing undead section, and then the Mummy archetype itself can be found on pages 52 and 53 of Book of the Dead, which starts with the level 2 Mummy dedication feat if you want to play that sort of character. Now, the full mechanical implications of playing a mummy are beyond the scope of this video, But as I've mentioned, the focus of this video is the concept of a hunger for the mummy. Other undead PCs in Pathfinder 2e come with pre-written hungers that you can use as kind of a driver or motivating force for that particular character. If you want to play a vampire PC, the hunger for blood is a natural part of your character's story. If you want to play a zombie PC, the hunger for brains is a natural part of that character's story. But as I've mentioned, mummies don't have a particular hunger, and it does make the archetype kind of stand out in contrast to the other options inside of the book. It feels a little bit like a letdown that the mummy doesn't have this pre-written driver that you can use to kind of springboard your storytelling. So today what I want to do is I want to give you 3 specific options for hungers that a mummy might use, and then talk about the story implications and some of the mechanical support for that idea. Now, the first hunger that I want to mention is not actually hunger, but thirst. Yeah, I feel like I'm cheating a little bit here, but if you look at the mummy dedication that you can take at 2nd level, the natural attacks of the mummy will draw water from the creature that they hit in melee, and as someone who created Salt Stalkers for RPG Superstar a couple of years ago, let's just say I am already fond of monsters that drain the water out of whatever creature they happen to be fighting. It's okay, Paizo. I'm willing to acknowledge that you copied a good idea. For the record, Paizo did not steal that idea from me. And I think if you want to make the concept of a hunger for the mummy archetype as simple and straightforward as possible, I think the idea of thirst is an easy one to do that fits within the mechanical abilities of the mummy. The image of the desiccated corpse of the mummy and the concept of the mummy drawing liquid from its victims fit together pretty naturally. And this has the benefit of being very straightforward. Some of the other options I'll talk about in this video are a little bit more vague and might be harder to apply to the story, but thirst is pretty straightforward, and it is something that would fit naturally into the narrative of games set in places like ancient Egypt. The harsh desert sun naturally fits with a monster that drains water from its victims. However, there is one downside to using thirst as the hunger for a mummy. At least on the surface, it doesn't have the destructive drive that you might associate with other hungers. When a vampire needs to drink blood, that is innately destructive to another creature. Same thing with the ghoul that consumes flesh or the zombie that consumes brains. That natural hunger that the undead PC has is destructive in a way that will naturally drive conflict in a story. Thirst, on the surface, doesn't have that destructive drive that other hungers might have, and could have less narrative impact as a result. Now you could expand thirst to where the mummy has to draw their water from a victim, and that would make it more destructive, but then the mummy ends up looking kind of like a copy of the vampire, and there's not as much narrative distinction as you might hope. I would say if you want to use thirst as the hunger for the mummy archetype, that you should find a way to make that thirst naturally destructive, where the mummy would seek to make the terrain around them inhospitable to life. But all of that being said, I don't think that the mummy archetype needs to resort to a strictly physical hunger. Hunger in Book of the Dead can be more than just a physical need that the undead creature has. Sure, ghouls might consume flesh, but other undead creatures have hungers that are more esoteric in nature, and a good example of that is the ghost. The hunger of the ghost is the desire to resolve things related to its past life. Maybe the ghost is driven by revenge against the creature that killed it, or maybe the ghost is driven by a need to complete some project that they never finished before their death. The hunger for the ghost is not a physical thing that the ghost consumes, but rather the ghost is driven by this emotional need to take care of its, as many stories call it, unfinished business. Hunger for an undead PC can be something more esoteric, something a little more vague, and I think that there are some options for mummies when it comes to emotional hungers that I think could have a lot of narrative potential. The first one that I'd like to talk about, and one that probably fits the easiest with Pathfinder 2e's take on the mummy, is the concept of territory or domain. In the mummy dedication, the mummy has to pick a particular type of land that they are supernaturally bound to in some fashion. Now, the classic example that we associate with places like Egypt or Osirian in the Galarian setting would obviously be the desert, but Paizo gives us several different options for mummies that have been created in other terrains and that are bound to other terrains, such as Arctic terrain or swamp terrain. In fact, several mummy feats build off of this idea, such as the level 4 mummy archetype feat, One with the Land. There is a large emphasis in Pathfinder's writings on the idea that the mummy is a form of undead that is bound to the land in a way that other undead would not normally be. In this way, mummies end up feeling more like certain fae, such as a dryad, than they do the typical undead creature. They are bound to some specific place, and their bond with that place feeds into the power that they have. And if you really want to double down on this idea, then the concept of an undead hunger driven by territory or domain would be a good fit for the mummy. Essentially, in death, the mummy takes ownership of a particular area, legitimately or illegitimately, and comes to see that area as theirs. That is their domain. They own it, they rule it, and no one is to interfere with or touch their domain. I think this creates a very natural motivation for the mummy PC, and I think it could lead to a lot of interesting story beats, as the character would be naturally very invested in a particular area. And there are a lot of different ways that you could manifest a territorial or domain-related hunger for the mummy. It could manifest where the mummy has to return to a particular location at certain intervals in order to recharge their power. Or maybe, ever so often, the mummy obsessively patrols their territory to make sure that it is safe, regardless of how lonely or abandoned that territory may be. And for fans of the old World of Darkness games, you may recognize where I got this one. If the mummy wants to leave their domain, maybe that mummy has to transport some of the soil from their domain and keep that on their person, or their powers slowly begin to fade. The narrative here is simple. The mummy is bound to that territory and is driven by their desire to control or rule that territory in some way. Now, there are some potential narrative hurdles to using territory or domain as the hunger for your mummy PC, and the biggest one is the geographical scope of your campaign. If you have a player character who is obsessed with a very particular location, and you want to take your game to literally any other location, a territorial style hunger could be problematic, as that character would not want to leave. Now, obviously, as a storyteller, you can do things to maybe draw the mummy out. Maybe someone has stolen an artifact from the mummy's territory, or maybe someone has damaged the mummy's territory, and the mummy has left their territory to take revenge or recover whatever has been stolen from them. There are still ways to use domain as a mummy's hunger, but be aware that it could affect the geographical scope of your story, and you want to think about that concept if you're considering using territory or domain as a mummy's hunger. Now, the final hunger option that I have for mummies is actually the one that I've talked about using at my gaming table. Full disclosure, none of my players have said that they want to play a mummy PC yet, so this has not actually shown up. I haven't used this in a game yet, but this is probably what I would default to if someone came to me with a mummy as a character concept, and that is the idea of vanity as the mummy's driving hunger. In short, using the concept of vanity for hunger would make it where the mummy would be obsessed with their status or appearance, and they would naturally be driven by a desire to improve their status or appearance in the minds of others, even though theoretically they've already passed on. By the way, mechanically, I think that this actually fits reasonably well with the mummy archetype. One of the mummy archetype feats is the level 4 feat, Semblance of Life, where the mummy can use illusion to make themselves appear like they are still living, even though they are literally a desiccated corpse. That feat is a very easy way of making Vanity into a mechanical effect. And if you think about a lot of the stories we associate with mummies, such as tombs filled with treasure, again, this idea of vanity can easily become a prominent story beat. Mummies that have been buried with a number of great treasures might naturally be obsessed with those treasures and how those treasures are viewed by the world around them. And vanity as a mummy's driving hunger is one of those things that could actually fit very well in terms of Pathfinder 2e storytelling. If the mummy is obsessed with their status, if they're obsessed with their appearance, then the mummy might naturally be driven to go and acquire new magical items or go and accomplish new great deeds that can be recorded about them so that their vanity can be fed. It's simple, it's straightforward, it can lead to some really good role-playing, and I think it could be a lot of fun. But alright, that gives us 3 possible hungers for our mummy PCs. Which one of them is the best to use? Is thirst the best? Is territory or domain the best? Or is vanity the best? Well, here's where I think it gets really fun. Paizo actually presents 3 different types of mummies in their description of the mummy archetype. Some mummies are created as guardians. It is their job to protect certain places or certain things, such as ancient tombs. Other mummies are individuals that chose that state, that wanted to become immortal through the power of undeath. These mummies were often rulers in life, and they wanted to continue to rule after death. And then finally, Paizo presents a 3rd type of mummy, which is essentially a mummy that was created accidentally through some sort of natural process. And I think for these 3 different mummies, you could naturally match them to different types of hunger. A mummy that was created through natural processes, through exposure to the elements, that could fit very naturally with the idea of thirst. That mummy comes back from the dead and is eternally attempting to feed the thirst that they remember with their last dying breath. Mummies that were created under the expectation that they would serve as guardians of particular locations, they would be a natural fit for the concept of territory or domain that I mentioned earlier. They are literally guardians of specific places, and they might have a hunger to see to the safety and care of that place, regardless of whether or not it will ever be used again. And then finally, the nobility turned undead, the emperor mummy, if you will, that is a natural fit for the concept of vanity that I mentioned earlier. So great was their rule in life that it must extend into death, and it is their purpose to see that all will sing their praises regardless of whether they draw breath or not. I think, depending upon how your mummy PC was created, you could use different types of hungers as a motivating factor for your character, and I think that they all could lead to interesting stories. But let me turn the conversation over to you. What do you think about the mummy archetype from the Book of the Dead, and what do you think about this concept of hunger that drives undead PCs? Do you think that mummies need a hunger in Pathfinder 2e? And if so, do you like the hunger options that I've presented? Do you like thirst, territory, or vanity, or some combination of the 3? Jump into the comments section down below and let me know your thoughts, and if you have a concept for a different type of hunger that could drive a mummy PC, leave that down there as well. Don't forget to do all of the YouTube stuff. Like, share, subscribe to the channel. Check out my free Discord and my Patreon. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.